Well, welcome again, and we are in this module going to be continuing our discussion from last time when we were looking at principles of just war theory. And so this is really going to build on that previous discussion. For some reason you haven't watched that module yet and done those readings, I would encourage you to go back and do that before we get underway on this module. But assuming that you have gone through all of those basic principles of just war theory with the different criteria for jus ad bellum and jus in bello, we're going to continue the conversation from there now. And really what I want to do in this module is cover a range of different topics that kind of flow out of that basic conversation. And so there's kind of three main areas that we're going to be looking at together in this module today. So the first one is going to be something I referenced in the earlier discussion of just war theory. And I mentioned at a couple of different points how in modern times, in recent years, there have been a number of proposals for ways that we would modify traditional just war theory to fit some of the particular characteristics of war in the contemporary 21st century world. And so there are proposals to make those sorts of modifications coming from both the left and the right ends of the political and theological spectrum. And so what I want to do in the first part of this module is to take a look at some of those different proposals that are being floated around regarding how we ought to modify the just war tradition for today, and talk about that and see what the various strengths and weaknesses of some of those proposals might be, and talk about how well they fit with the basic premises that just war theory is built upon. So that's going to be the first thing we look at. After that, I do want to take just a little bit of time as kind of the second main topic for the module to at least talk a little bit about Christian pacifism. We don't really have the time to do in any way a real thorough treatment of pacifism, or even really kind of a full-bore introduction to pacifism and Christian thinking here. But I at least want to touch on the topic and introduce some of the ideas at work in Christian pacifism, and also to give you an introduction to a little bit of reading from a contemporary Christian pacifist that I think would be helpful to kind of rounding out our look at these issues of war and violence from a Christian perspective in today's world. So we'll do that pacifism section there in the middle. And then I want to conclude today's module by shifting gears a little bit and focusing specifically on the issue of torture, because this is, I think, in many ways related to just war theory and this use of violence in pursuit of justice. But it's a particular kind of subset of that topic, and it is something that gets a lot of attention and discussion in 21st century America. And in particular, there's a lot of debate regarding the use of torture or enhanced interrogation when it comes to dealing with terrorism. And so I want to talk a little bit about that and how just war theory and how Catholic social teaching and natural law principles could help guide our thinking when it comes to those issues of torture or enhanced interrogation and how we deal with terrorism. So those are the three things I want to look at here in this module, and I think they all build on the basic foundation of just war theory from last time, and I think working through some of these specific issues that flow from that will help us gain a better understanding in retrospect of the basic principles of just war theory and how they might be applied to some of the specific challenges and debates that we face in our world today. All right then, so the first of these sets of proposals for how we might adjust just war theory to meet the challenges of the modern world, we're going to look at a set that come from the right end of the political and theological spectrum. And so I'm going to ask you to take a look at an article written by George Weigel, and you may or may not have heard of him. Many of you may have. He's a pretty prominent Catholic author. He has written a number of popular books and some more serious academic works, and also writes a great deal of material for various magazines and journals and such. So I'm going to give you an article he wrote for the magazine First Things. This is, if I'm recalling correctly, in the context of the first Gulf War. He talked about some of the ways that just war theory would apply to some of these modern conflicts that America is facing in the 21st century. And so in particular, he is responding to some challenges that seem to deviate a bit from the traditional understanding of just war theory, that what we're dealing with in just war theory are sort of these two nation states where one invades the other, and where then there is a defense against that aggression, and we follow all the rules that we outlined last time. And basically Weigel argues that many of the conflicts that we face in the world today don't really fit that sort of scheme, right? That things are messier and much more complicated. And just for a couple of pertinent examples from our recent history, right, there are the challenges of what we do with non-state actors. So that is, how do you engage in war with an opposing force, an opposing group, where they are not a traditional nation state? And obviously this is going to involve terror organizations, so things like Al-Qaeda. How do you engage in conflict with them? Because in many ways they don't seem to fit purely sort of criminal behavior, right? That this doesn't seem like a traditional case of dealing with criminal activity. This isn't really so much just an issue of police work, right, or internal security. That in many cases these groups are highly organized, they're operating across national boundaries. So it's not the same as just dealing with a criminal or even a band of criminals, right? They act more like a state than that. They have financing and a power structure and access to sophisticated weapons and logistics. Of course, at the same time, they're not like a nation state either, right? That they don't have an embassy that we can go to. They don't have a recognized political hierarchy. And so, for example, when we're doing traditional just war thinking, right, that part of what you do is ultimately seek to bring about a resolution through diplomatic channels. So once we're reaching the end of a war, that we can send messages through diplomatic channels to say, hey, we are close to the end here, it's time to resolve this. We ask that you surrender with the following terms, and they can agree or not. Or even in a very kind of basic sense, if it's not a group or a nation that you can reason with, you could at least get to the point where, look, we have conquered all of their territory, right? Germany, for example, in World War II, we have taken over Germany now. There is no more Nazi state to fight because, look, we're in it. We've taken control of it. And again, with something like Al-Qaeda, that isn't really a possibility, right? There is no place that we can go and secure, and now we've dealt with the problem. And so one of the things that Weigel is arguing is that when dealing with these kinds of enemies, it's going to have to change the way we think through how we do things. What would we recognize as a proper end to the war? How would we think about last resort if there's no official government to negotiate? Those sorts of things. And then also he talks about, what do we do with the so-called rogue states, right? What do we do with states that don't seem to act like normal, reasonable actors on the world stage? Again, they don't seem to follow the rules, and so does that require us to act differently? So this could be famously in kind of recent times, various presidents have pointed to North Korea or to Iraq or to Iran as these kinds of rogue states that require a different approach. We can't treat them using the normal methods of just war reasoning and action. Okay, so let's talk about some specific ways that Weigel would propose we change things, right? And so, for example, one thing that he says we might need to consider is thinking more broadly about what would constitute just cause, right? And this is where we get, again, back to the Gulf Wars, and in particular the Second Gulf War, which in retrospect, maybe that is what the article is focusing on, not the first one. In the Second Gulf War, right, one of the main arguments for entering into that war, jus ad bellum, was that Saddam Hussein was thought to be amassing weapons of mass destruction. And given previous behavior of this rogue state, there was reason to believe that there would not be the sort of standard declaration of war and ultimatums and warnings before we would have the use of these weapons of mass destruction. Right? There was a real fear, at least in some sectors, that once these weapons of mass destruction were in that nation's control, that they would use them without provocation, without warning, in aggressive attacks on their neighbors. There's a very similar argument that goes on in regard to Iran and its pursuit of nuclear weapons. Many people would argue that even being close to attaining nuclear weapons for a state like Iran would constitute just cause for entering into war, because of the nature of the risk, right? Because of the nature of these regimes, and combining that with the power of modern weapons of mass destruction, right? And so the argument is that traditional just war theory, which would say you have to wait until you are actually invaded or an ally is invaded, worked fine when we're talking about swords, or even when we're talking about traditional firearms and airplanes and bombs and even that sort of thing. But that when you have ballistic missiles carrying nuclear warheads or chemical warheads or biological agents, that changes the reasoning, right? And that one can't run the risk of a nuclear weapon exploding in Jerusalem. That's just not an acceptable risk, right? And so Iran having even that capability would be seen as just cause for entering into war. So that would be one type of proposal that Weigel would say needs to be considered in modifying just war theory for the modern world. Along those same lines would be a modification to what constitutes last resort. And again, when dealing with non-state groups like Al-Qaeda, or when dealing with rogue states like Iraq or Iran or North Korea or things like this, that last resort doesn't really make sense, right? That given their history, given their patterns of behavior, that we don't need to go through all of the processes of attempting diplomatic and economic arrangements and solutions, that we know very well that they are not in fact going to change their behavior based on those sorts of negotiations or reasonings, and in fact the only thing that is going to produce a real change in their aggressive behavior is going to be the use of military force. And so the argument here would be that in fact the right side, the just side, can in these sorts of situations be the first to use military force, whereas traditionally in just war thinking it is almost always the side that uses military force first that is the aggressor and therefore the unjust party. Now, what should we think about these proposals from Weigel and many others who would advocate similar things when it comes to just war reasoning in the face of these modern threats that America faces in the 21st century? And I don't have necessarily the definitive answer to this, right? This is an issue that is being debated and contested in the political realm as well as in kind of the realm of theology and ethics and just war theory. Certainly, I think Weigel makes some valid points, right? That there are real challenges in adapting traditional just war thinking to some of these features of the modern world, right? Where you can have groups like Al-Qaeda, and if they were ever to actually be in possession of a nuclear weapon, that would seem to constitute a threat that's not maybe necessarily unique, but that does present challenges that differ a lot from the question of whether or not France is going to invade England in the 15th century, right? That there's a different sort of scenario there in terms of the timetable that would be involved, the potential for immediate and widespread destruction and those sorts of things. And presumably we could conclude that these non-state actors aren't going to be restrained probably even in the ways that aggressive states typically are, right? That they don't have to be concerned about the ramifications of their actions for a civilian population because there is no civilian population to be concerned about, and therefore they are going to be able to take aggressive steps even in ways that very aggressive nations might not do for fear of the family back home, if for no other reason. And so I do think there are real challenges raised there. On the other hand, right, in terms of thinking about this from the perspective of Catholic social teaching, I think there's cause for concern with making these sorts of changes as well. And that there's a reason that a body of principles grew up around the use of military force to guide it. Because as with many of the things we've been talking about this semester, with power, with wealth, with military power, there is a tendency on the part of those who possess a great deal of power or wealth to use it in ways that are really to their advantage, even if the argument, or even if they have led themselves to believe that they are doing this primarily for reasons of justice, right? And what we find when we look, say, in the economic realm is that we find many economic systems that are subtly but really skewed to direct the primary benefits to those with wealth and power and position. And they may not even recognize that in many cases as being what is going on, but in fact it is the case. And presumably a very similar thing can happen in the realm of politics and military power, that those who possess the most power, there's going to be a natural tendency and temptation to sort of skew things in the direction of supporting the existing power structures. And so on a kind of really very basic level, I can't help but find it a little ironic whenever one hears a news report about how it is imperative that we prevent nation A, B, or C from possessing nuclear weapons. And this conclusion is typically reached by the United States and its allies, which happen to also constitute the group of nations that already possess nuclear weapons, right? And so for this body of international powers that goes around telling other nations they can't have nuclear weapons, when in fact they have at their disposal a vast stockpile of nuclear weapons, seems at least to create a tension, if not being just purely hypocritical. Now again, do I think it would be a good idea for Iran to have a stockpile of nuclear weapons? Certainly not. Do I think that there might be more to the story in America's desire to prevent other nations from having nuclear weapons than simply a desire for the pure pursuit of peace and justice in the world? I think we would all have to acknowledge that there's at least a significant danger of that, if not an obvious reality of America wanting to maintain a military power position that is advantageous for us in many ways. And so, again, whether or not it would be a good idea to adopt some of the specific things Weigel suggests is something that can be and is debated. But I do think we at least need to recognize, if we're going to accept the basic principles of Catholic social teaching, that there is an inherent danger in giving more room and more power to those who already possess the most power and authority in certain spheres, right? And so giving America a wider range of possible acts and ways to exercise their power should at least make us very concerned about the potential for the abuse of that power, which we see raised again and again in Catholic social teaching. Now, as I said before, it is not only from the right-hand end of the political spectrum that one encounters proposals for changing the way we think about just war theory. There are also proposals that come more from the left-hand end of the spectrum. And actually, Weigel raises several of these in the discussion in his article. And he would point to a development that you see in a lot of writing about just war theory, which is the idea that just war theory ought to begin with a presumption against war. Now, I think to be fair, we ought to admit, and I think Weigel could admit, right, that in some ways a presumption against war does make sense, right? That given a realistic understanding of the way the world works, and given the basic principle of just war theory of last resort, we would acknowledge that in some ways a presumption against war is built into just war theory, right? That we recognize within the theory itself this emphasis on avoiding war if it is at all possible. And so we ought not to engage in war if there's any other way of dealing with a situation, which I think you could rephrase that in large extent to saying that we have a presumption against war. So that would be one example of a amendment to just war theory, kind of from the left, that I think we could see something to it. At the same time, I think it also raises certain problems, which Weigel points out, right? That if we're going to say that there is always a presumption against war, and that war, in a lot of this discussion, you get, it goes beyond simply saying a presumption against war, right? And there's the idea that war is kind of intrinsically wrong in some way. This is where things become more problematic, right? So that if we're going to start talking about a war in a way that says it is an evil but sometimes a necessary evil, right, this should raise all kinds of warning flags for people versed in natural law theory, right? Because we can never perform an act that is intrinsically evil, regardless of the reasoning or regardless of the ends being pursued. So if, in fact, war is intrinsically wrong in some way, which many of these statements seem to imply, if not explicitly say, then we're presented with a real problem, and I think an internal contradiction when it comes to trying to reconcile this with the broader just war tradition and natural law. That we can't find ourselves in a position of saying, well, war is intrinsically wrong, but we're going to enter into it regardless in certain situations. That's not a route that is open to us, given the nature of Catholic ethics and given the nature of natural law theory. So I think Weigel makes a valid criticism of this sort of language from the left that we encounter in a lot of places today. Now, apart from sort of those terminological changes, there are also other kind of more concrete proposals from the left regarding ways we ought to modify just war theory in today's world. And so I just wanted to mention some of those here. And again, Weigel mentions some of these in the course of his article. So for example, there is discussion of competent authority, right? And many would say that in today's world, competent authority, it's not sufficient to only have the leader of a particular nation declare a war, right? That one must reach some sort of international consensus, which may or may not involve a UN resolution. And so some would argue that we need to move beyond the authority of just one particular nation and have this larger global authority involved for a war to be just. And again, there are various arguments people would bring forward for that. In terms of the reasoning of Catholic thought, there might be benefits to that, right? That certainly some nations act in ways that hopefully most nations would recognize as wrong, and that could prevent that behavior. But I think also, of course, this would raise some issues in terms of subsidiarity, right? That sort of taking authority and power to a global level and not even just a national level would seem to only compound some of the problems that a lack of subsidiarity produces in the world around us today. So I think that might be a challenging thing to reconcile with Catholic social teaching in many ways. There's also issues raised about proportionality in modern war, and those who would argue that discussions of proportionality aren't really meaningful and aren't really possible in an era of weapons of mass destruction and an increasing firepower. And so many would argue, and you can see this especially in some of the statements put out by the U.S. bishops in, say, the 80s with the height of the Cold War, where the U.S. and Russia seemed poised to obliterate each other and basically the entire world at the push of a button. And so there was a real question of whether or not it was possible to talk about proportionality, given the potential stakes of a conflict between those two powers. And again, there are real risks posed by the nature of modern warfare. At the same time, I think to be fair about it, if we look at recent military conflicts, while there are certainly staggering losses in many places, and while there is a great deal of destructive force at work, it is not the case that all of these conflicts have escalated into a global nuclear warfare. In fact, there have been many small conflicts. Not that say that they are justified, but it doesn't seem to be the case that modern war, by its nature, has to be a total war risking global annihilation. And in similar ways, right, there is the a counterpart to the competent authority with last resort, similar to what we talked about with Weigel's proposal. So in this case, from the left, the question of last resort would be whether or not, along with kind of UN authorization, that one would have to go through sort of the international diplomatic process at some length before a war could be considered just, right? And that one would need to receive one or more UN resolutions before we would be meeting the criterion of last resort. And so that is something brought forward again by those on the left who would say we need to modify some traditional just war thinking. And again, I think while last resort is a traditional aspect of just war theory, this raising of the sphere of decision making from the national to the international level is at least challenging to reconcile with the ideas of subsidiarity. And then when we look at the way the UN and organizations like it function in the world today, I think there are at least reasons to have questions about how effective such an approach might be in really dealing with the challenges that just war theory is meant to deal with. And so that is another proposal that there might well be something to, but that would also have some challenges in terms of reconciling it with the broader school of thought. And then finally, one other criterion that's put forward sometimes in terms of jus ad bellum would be comparative justice, right? And this would be we heard examples of this, for example, after 9/11 and prior to the war in Afghanistan, where some critics, both in the U.S. and abroad, will raise the question of comparative justice, saying, well, yes, these attacks were horrible and are clearly unjust attacks, but we also need to consider what might have provoked them, right? And that we need to look at injustices performed by the U.S. or its allies in these various parts of the world. And so, again, I think one can recognize at least some validity to raising these issues. The question is whether or not this needs to be a change to just war theory. And I think from my perspective, I would say it's never been an assumption of just war theory that those working through the reasoning process are morally perfect. And for example, within the existing criterion of right intention, that would already call for a real discernment process where those declaring war have to do some serious reflection on whether or not their intentions in this conflict are correct. And so presumably that would include recognizing ways that one has contributed to this conflict and taking that into consideration. So I think that is already built in many ways to existing traditional just war theory. And I think there's a danger in this language of comparative justice of, again, introducing this idea implicitly that there is no morally right conduct of war, that all war is morally compromised, and therefore what we do in a just war is making use of something that is intrinsically wrong in some way. And again, whether or not there's ever been a perfectly pure moral state that has entered into war is certainly questionable. But there does seem to be a real danger in bringing into Catholic ethical reasoning the idea that we occasionally ought to do something that is in its nature immoral, which I think is deeply problematic. Okay, moving then, there's one last set of proposals here that I at least want to mention before we leave this topic. And again, coming more from the left end of the political spectrum, is the proposal of another category of just war criteria and this would be jus post bellum, right? That would be how to act rightly after war. And so, again, this is not kind of an official set school of thought. There are different forms of these ideas floating around, but some of the things proposed are along the lines of there ought to be a vindication of rights. That is, after any conflict, both sides ought to acknowledge wrongdoing and ought to make a vindication for any wrongs that they have performed in the course of war. There ought to be reconciliation, right? That the two sides ought to not just cease hostilities, but ought to, in fact, actively work to repair relationships between the two sides. And then finally, there ought to be restoration. That is, the successful or the victorious side, presuming it's the just side, ought to work to restore the loser's nation, work to restore things for the people of the opposing side. And again, very much along the lines of what we saw, for example, in World War II, where the U.S. was actively involved in the rebuilding efforts of Germany and Japan. And so those are some of the kinds of things proposed as a addendum to just war theory. And again, I don't think any of those ideas are problematic. There certainly ought to be investigation and treatment of any crimes or immoral acts committed, even by those who are on the right side of a conflict. There ought to be reconciliation, obviously, for Christians. And part of that can, in fact, be restoring the productivity in the nation of our enemies. So I don't think any of those things are in and of themselves problematic. But again, I would come back to concerns about making this part of just war theory with apparently the implicit idea that war is always morally compromised, which again does reflect experience, right? In the real world, there often is ulterior motives involved in even the most just war. At the same time, building in a presumption that these actions are intrinsically wrong, but still having a scheme for approving them just seems deeply problematic. But I would be interested in hearing your thoughts on that, and we can discuss your take on these different proposals for modifying just war theory, or maybe there's others we haven't raised here that you would like to propose. But we can continue that discussion on Blackboard. And then now I want to move and take a look, at least briefly, at talking about the tradition of Christian pacifism. Now, Christian pacifism is a long tradition, right? There's a great deal of development in that tradition that we can't even really begin to cover here. But I at least wanted to mention this as another perspective in the tradition when it comes to thinking about how we use force in pursuit of justice, because there have been really throughout church history those who have argued that we ought not to use force in the pursuit of justice. In some cases, not even internally within a state in terms of using force against criminals, but more broadly, and what has received more attention in the tradition is the idea of not using military force to deal with international conflict, right? That we ought to meet unjust attackers when they invade our lands, not with force, but with essentially turning the other cheek. And so what can we say about this? At least something briefly to just acknowledge this other perspective on how to deal with injustice in the world. And again, certainly there are a lot of things you could turn to read, to learn about this. But obviously, in many ways, it goes back to, in essence, Jesus himself, right? And that when we look at just that phrase, turn the other cheek, we can find much of the basis for Christian pacifism in Jesus' teaching. In particular, his teaching in the Sermon on the Mount, where in fact he says that. And again, we need to acknowledge that Jesus is not just talking about when somebody insults you or when somebody literally smacks you upside the head, right? That he was obviously talking in a very charged political military context, right? That Israel was chafing under Roman rule. They had been conquered and they were being systematically oppressed by the Roman Empire. And there were many people, of course, in that society, in his audience probably, who were supporters of a military rebellion in response to that injustice. Right? So when Jesus talks about turning the other cheek, when he talks about carrying the pack 2 miles instead of just 1, right? He is not ignorant of or unaware of the political ramifications of that. And of course, we see it not just in his teaching, right? We see it in Jesus' own response to unjust attacks and violence in his own life, right? That he, when attacked, very literally and physically, does not make use of the power at his disposal to stop the attack. Instead, he accepts it. And in accepting that, he transforms it, right? That Jesus' acceptance of the unjust punishment and torture and crucifixion is the means for God bringing salvation to the world, right? And so we have lived out by Jesus himself this response of not meeting injustice with violence, right? Another aspect to kind of draw out from that, right, is that this is rooted in a basically Christian understanding of the nature of reality, right, which has a couple key components to it. One is the belief that this life, as we currently experience, is not all that there is in fact something more, that there will be an eternal life, a restoration and renewal and transformation of this world as we know it, when it will become a fully realized kingdom of God for eternity. And so that this is not all there is, and so that if, by extension, one were to die for what is right in this life, that's not the end of the story, right? That in fact, death, given that belief, is not the worst thing that there is. What would be worse would be to lose one's place in that fully realized kingdom of God. And so that if one needs to die in order to be part of that kingdom or to advance that kingdom, then that is the right choice. And again, this is a legitimate part of Christian belief that needs to be acknowledged, right? One of the ways that Christian natural law differs from, say, Aristotelian natural law is on this very point, the acknowledgement of the fact that there is more than this life as we currently experience it. So whereas Aristotle would see the idea of, say, St. Francis embracing total poverty, he would see that as kind of a bit unbalanced, right? That there's no good reason to do that if this life is all there is, right? Because you're putting yourself in this position of poverty and a loss of a reasonable enjoyment of physical pleasures and goods. From St. Francis's perspective, he is only doing this as part of a much larger plan, right? That when he accepts that poverty for the time being, he is contributing to the eternal kingdom of God, and that in the end it will, of course, all be worth it. And a similar thing can go on in regard to St. Francis's embrace of pacifism, of not meeting unjust attacks with violence. Because, again, if one is to die as a result, one hasn't lost, right? In fact, that can be part of bringing about the kingdom of God. And so I think we need to acknowledge that there are aspects of the foundations of pacifism that really do resonate with the basic premises of the Christian message. And we can see this, not just in St. Francis, but in many of the saints, right, who are willing to embrace their mistreatment in this life because they believe that their acceptance of that and their response of it without the use of violence is contributing to the ultimate realization of the kingdom of God. Right, and I think it's important to note here some of the common rebuttals to pacifism. I'm going to have you read an excerpt from Stanley Hauerwas, who is someone we've looked at before. And so I've said before, he's, arguably the most prominent American theologian today, and he is a pacifist, along with his critiques of American capitalism. And so following the 9/11 attacks, he generated a great deal of controversy by calling for a pacifist response to those attacks, and he was very critical of America's response using military means, particularly with the war in Afghanistan, and by extension, the other military conflicts in the Middle East of recent years. And I've asked students to read this before, and there are many very vehement responses to Hauerwas, with varying degrees, I think, of validity. But I think it's important to point out a couple things in advance, right? First of all, Hauerwas is not claiming that we ought to be completely passive in the face of unjust attacks. Right? Pacifism is not passivity, right? It doesn't mean that one is just a doormat. And so, to illustrate this, you could point to the examples of, say, Gandhi or Martin Luther King Jr., who used nonviolent means of protest in response to injustice, right? So there's a great deal of difference between allowing yourself to be bullied and quietly kind of sitting in the corner, waiting for it to pass, and meeting injustice and violence with nonviolent responses, right? That there is, when you look at the examples of civil rights movements like Martin Luther King Jr.'s or Gandhi's, this is not just being passive, right? There is an active response to the injustice, highlighting the injustice by accepting it, but it's not purely passive. So that's an important thing to note, right? That this does not mean we don't do anything in the face of evil. It means we simply don't make use of violence or force as our response. The other thing to note is that there's no presumption that it's going to work, right? That it is going to be an effective socio-political or economic response to injustice in our world, right? So to those who would say, well, look, if you do this, Islam is going to win, there's no pacifist strategic plan that's going to show how, in fact, pacifism will defeat the spread of radical Islam in the 21st century. Now, it should be noted, of course, citing again some of the previous examples of Gandhi and Martin Luther King, that in many cases, nonviolent responses to injustice do work, right? That in fact, they can succeed in surprising ways. And even if you look at the history of Christianity as a whole, the fact that it has survived and flourished to become the largest religion in the world is evidence of this, right? That there was a great deal of unjust attack on early Christianity, which was met not with any sort of military response or rebellion. And in fact, through that, it spread and became the religion of the Roman Empire. Nonviolent confrontation of evil worked in the American Civil Rights Movement and worked in the struggles in India with Gandhi. So it can work. However, the claim of pacifism is not that it's the right approach because it will produce the desired political outcome. Instead, right, this is an eschatological hope, right? It is premised on the idea that ultimately God is going to set things right, and that we are called to this response of nonviolent resistance of evil as our way of obediently responding to God's call, and that we're going to trust that He will resolve this ultimately. And that may not happen in a particular person's life. Now again, I often get students who will say, well, they can say that, but in reality, they're not really going to live that out, right? Because no one would stand by and just watch everyone be killed. And again, I would just say in response to that, if we look at history, in fact, that's not accurate, right? There are many pacifists who have stood by their principles to the end. Kind of very poignantly and fairly recently, kind of an example of this was when there was that horrific kidnapping, hostage, and murder situation in an Amish schoolhouse where these horrible people kidnapped and then killed all of these Amish school children. And the response of the community to that, I think, reflected their commitment to their principles, right? That they did not respond in anger. Violence wasn't really an option because the attackers died in the incident as well. But it was, I think, very powerful expression of their principles that they reached out to the families of the attackers and offered them their condolences and support and forgiveness. And so I think if people can do that in that sort of a situation, it shows that in fact pacifists can and do embrace their beliefs to the bitter end, to their logical conclusion. Now, of course, some may not, but the fact is that many have and many would. And so I think we can't just say, oh, well, this wouldn't really work, or you wouldn't really live it out, because that doesn't really address, I think, pacifism as it's rightly understood and practiced and lived out by people who follow it. Now, at the end of the day, I continue to accept just war theory, and the church as a whole has endorsed just war theory pretty much throughout the history of the teaching of the church. So why not reach the conclusion of pacifism, right? And again, this is a long, complicated discussion that we can only briefly hint at here. But I would say that what we need to do is recognize that we are ultimately headed for the kingdom of God, that we are in a transitional period, right? That we, as it were, have one foot in the kingdom of God and one foot in the kingdom of this world, that we're divided still between the city of man and the city of God. And that while we can work to bring about that kingdom and eschatological hope, we also have natural rights, natural obligations, natural law that we are called to follow at the same time in this life now. And at the end of the day, there are people like St. Francis or those who are called to religious life who are going to live out the kingdom of God in a way that is a foretaste of what we might all experience someday, God willing, right? And so just as we can see celibacy or poverty by people who have that particular calling and vocation, it is not the standard for most Christians, right? Because we are still in a place where we have natural obligations to friends and family and community. And I would say this is true for leaders of states or leaders of families, right? That as much as we might want to be part of the kingdom of God, we also have our responsibilities here and now, affirmed in Romans 13 famously and elsewhere, which would say that we do in fact have obligations that we need to follow, right? And just as it would not be appropriate for me to try to go and become a priest and leave behind my obligations to my wife and children, similarly, one could argue, I think, that as much as we might want to embrace the nonviolent response of Jesus or the saints to aggression individually, if we are members of a family, if we have a married vocation, or as a nation, we might want to embrace that, but to do that at this point, given our calling in life, would be to violate the responsibilities we have towards family or towards community to protect them against unjust attack. And so there's much more, I think, to the response than that, but I think that would be the essence of why I would say, despite how appealing I think pacifism can be on the basis of Christian principles, I think it also needs to be balanced with a recognition of other obligations and responsibilities we have, and that we can discern both through natural law and that we find affirmed in Scripture. Now then, the last thing I want to talk about here in this module, kind of wrapping up just war theory and how we respond to attacks and violent aggression in the modern world, is to shift gears a little bit and look at the questions around the use of torture in the modern world. And in particular, this is an issue in connection with how do we respond to terrorism or the threat of terrorism. And obviously, this has become a real hotly contested issue given recent history. And of course, as we probably have all learned if we follow the news or politics at all, in the aftermath of the killing of Osama bin Laden, right, it came to light that some of the information that ultimately led to locating him and carrying out that attack was obtained through the use of enhanced interrogation on different detainees that the U.S. Had in their custody. And so, of course, the enhanced interrogation method most talked about in recent years is waterboarding, right, which is this procedure where a person is tied down and their heads are covered, and that water is poured over their face with this cloth covering on it. And basically, the result of this process is that it simulates the experience of drowning. And so if you go onto the internet, of course, you can find examples of this being demonstrated. So you can look, and I can provide a link for you where you can find, right, demonstrations of what waterboarding is like. And what you will find when you look at that, there's a famous one where the Christopher Hitchens, right, the noted new atheist, who I would disagree with on most everything, went through this process, right, was investigating waterboarding as a sort of ethics issue, and volunteered to be waterboarded, and he went into it, and he lasted mere seconds before he yelled out his safe word to stop the process because he couldn't endure the experience. Now again, I have no great love for Christopher Hitchens by any stretch of the imagination, but I think it was a powerful demonstration of the nature of waterboarding, right? And that while we might call it enhanced interrogation, many people, I think rightly, would conclude that waterboarding is in fact torture. So how do we think through these issues? What should we think about the use of torture or the use of things like waterboarding, and what guidance can Catholic social teaching or just war principles or Catholic ethics give us in working through all of this? Well, again, this is a huge topic, and so on Blackboard I'm going to give you a link to a fairly lengthy document put together by the USCCB dealing with this as a moral issue, dealing with torture. And you'll see just from even looking at it that from immediately one of the things the bishops want you to be aware of is that torture is in fact a moral issue, right? That this is not just part of the process of justice or the legal system or our military system that we just ought to accept, right? In fact, it's very clear that the bishops are going to find torture deeply morally problematic. And so this is not going to be something that we can just accept as part of our general acceptance of U.S. foreign policy or particular political platform, right? So, well, what are we going to say about torture when it comes to thinking about it from the perspective of Catholic ethics? And again, this is a complicated topic, but we would begin with, as the bishops do in their document, the fundamental principles of Catholic ethics, right? Which is to recognize the intrinsic dignity of every human person, right? And from that, we can draw out the consequence that we ought to never intentionally harm an innocent person, and we ought to never treat a person as a means to an end, right? And this is where we start to get to how we ought to think through the issue of torture, right? And so if we're going to define torture, right, and of course this is one of the real debates that goes on today, but let's set that question aside for the moment, right? And let's say that torture we're going to see as a treatment of a person that degrades them, that violates their human dignity or that intrinsic value, right? Or another way of saying it would be treatment that we're going to call torture is treatment that treats a person as a means to an end, right? That we are no longer treating this detainee as a person, we are treating this detainee as a source of information or as a strategic asset, right? This is not a person, this is an information source, and we are going to treat them accordingly, right? That I'm not concerned about treating you like a person, you're a piece of information, or you are an information receptacle that I'm trying to get information out of. Right? And look, if we were in a situation where we desperately needed information off of a hard drive, right, we can do whatever we need to that hard drive to get information. I can crack the case open, I can move the wires around, I can shine lasers on it, whatever it is I need to do to get information off of that hard drive, if it's going to save lives, by golly, I can do that, right? I can do whatever I need to get information off that hard drive. There's no moral issue there, right? When we replace that hard drive with a human being, this becomes obviously much more problematic, right? And in one way of thinking about it, what torture does is to treat that person like the hard drive, right? That our objective, our way of looking at this situation is this being has information inside of it that we need, so we're going to do whatever we need to do to get that information out, right? And it would be difficult, I think, to come up with a scenario that would more clearly illustrate treating a person as a means to an end than that sort of situation. And so, to the extent that that happens, the bishops are going to conclude that we cannot do this. Now again, this becomes a big, complicated, hotly contested issue, right? And we don't want to deny that this is very difficult. We don't want to make this seem falsely simple, right? Because as one of the articles I'll ask you to look at talks about, it's not outside the realm of possibility that we could face a ticking time bomb scenario, right? And so this is a particular way of thinking about these issues that has been popular in recent years, which assumes that we have a person in our custody who we have reason to believe knows the location of a ticking time bomb, right? Where we have a nuclear weapon in the heart of New York City that is poised to go off in just a few hours. And we have reason to believe that this person knows the location of that weapon. So this is our ticking time bomb scenario. And anyone who's really thinking about the possibility is going to acknowledge that this would be a very difficult situation, right? That there would be a huge amount of coercive force leading us to do whatever we needed to do to get that information to save millions and millions of lives. So we shouldn't deny it as a really difficult, vexed situation and just say, oh, well, that's treating a person as a means to an end, so we can't do that. So it would be, obviously, a very difficult scenario to find oneself in. At the same time, right, does the fact that the stakes would be huge and that the emotional pressures would be extreme, does that change the intrinsic nature of the act? Right? And again, this is where I think we have to go back to the foundations of natural law, right? Which is to say that we can have discussions about culpability, right? That if a particular soldier found themselves in that situation and resorted to the use of torture, if we were to judge them after the fact, presumably we would take into consideration the emotional situation they found themselves in. Now, at the same time, though, that question of culpability is distinct from the question of the morality of the act, which would be to say, are we in fact, or ought we to use torture in that sort of situation? And there, following the basic reasoning of natural law theory, we would have to conclude no, right? That we can never intentionally do something wrong, regardless of the objectives that we are aiming for. And that is true regardless of the stakes and regardless of the nature of the person we're dealing with. And that last point there is, of course, one that the bishops are going to highlight in their document, right? Because one of the things that complicates this discussion and I think makes it difficult for people to accept what the church's position on this would be is the nature of the people we are talking about, right? And again, now this would be a difficult scenario regardless of who's involved. But when we're thinking about, who are the iconic bad guys of our day, right? The Nazis have long been the standard example of who is the bad guy. So when Jesus says to love your enemy, entire generations of people in classes could discuss, could you love the Nazis, right? And admittedly, that would be very difficult. But in 21st century America, right, the Nazis are becoming a fairly distant past. When we think about who our enemy is today, and again, we don't even have, the Soviets, the communist bloc, right? That's in our past as well at this point. Who is the bad guy, right? Who is the enemy that we ought to love? And I think the clearest example of that for modern America would be a terrorist, and specifically kind of radical Islamic terrorists, right? That would really be the epitome of the enemy when we talk about it in biblical terms. And the bishops make this point, right, that we are called in the Bible and Christian tradition to love our enemies. And that is true even if our enemy is a radical terrorist. Right now, of course, this doesn't mean that we approve of what they do. This doesn't mean that we don't try to stop any unjust aggression or attacks, but we are still called to love them. Well, what does that mean? Right? Well, that doesn't necessarily mean pacifism, right, as we just talked about. But on a basic level, when we say that we love a person, what we are doing is treating them as a person. We are willing their integral good as a person. We're willing the good of the other. Now, I think that kind of love is compatible with the use of force to stop unjust behavior, right? That we can love someone as a society that we incarcerate, right? We can say, look, not only are you harming others who we are called to love and protect, but you are harming yourself by engaging in this unjust behavior. And that incarcerating you is actually not only to the benefit of the people you might attack, but it is also in a real way to your benefit, because it will prevent you from further corrupting yourself with these unjust actions, and hopefully it will also give you an opportunity to amend your life and to change for the better. So though, what can we say in connection with the situation we're talking about here with a terror suspect who has information we might need? Can torturing them be compatible with love, right? And basically the bishops argue it cannot, right? That treating another person as an object is not compatible with loving them. It is not compatible with willing their true integral good. Now, right, the response may very well be along the lines of, but we can use force. We can use force that will hurt another person. We can even use force that will kill another person in a war, right? Or in criminal activity, right? That if a policeman comes upon a scene where a man is kind of, let's say it's a kind of Looney Tunes cartoon sort of situation where he's standing there and he's got the plunger on the detonator in his hands, and you can look over and you see this pile of TNT under a whole bunch of people off in the distance, right? The policeman can, in fact, in that situation, shoot the man, right, who has his hand on that plunger, because he is about to kill all of these innocent people, right? And so if it is in fact morally correct to use that kind of lethal force even on somebody who is about to blow up a bunch of innocent people, why can we not use torture in the ticking time bomb scenario, right? And this is a very difficult distinction and argument for many people, right? And many people would argue that these are essentially the same situation. But basically, the Catholic ethical response to that would be to say that this is not, in fact, the same situation, right? That when somebody is a detainee, they are no longer actively able to harm others, right? This is why, for example, you can't mistreat a prisoner of war, right? Are they innocent in the sense of fully innocent and desiring the good of others? No. But they are innocent in the sense of we can't intentionally harm an innocent person, right? Because once somebody is your prisoner of war, they are no longer in a position to actively harm others, right? And so I cannot go into the holding cell in the prisoner of war camp and start shooting people. Now, you could say, well, look, they would be out there shooting us if they were able to, but the fact of the matter is they are not able to. They have been rendered non-combatants, right? And if they are a non-combatant, they are innocent in the sense of we can't intentionally harm innocent people because they are not actively engaged in the harming of others, right? And a similar situation is going on in the case of the detainee who we believe has information about the location of a ticking time bomb. That person is no longer actively causing the harm to other people. And so we are not able to shoot them, torture them, whatever the case may be, because they have been rendered by their captivity innocent in that sense. Now, this will strike many people as a fairly fine distinction, and admittedly, it is in some ways a fine distinction, But just because something is a fine distinction doesn't make it morally irrelevant, right? There is an important difference between an act of that we intentionally cause and an act that is an unintended consequence of what we are really trying to accomplish, right? And if we basically eliminate that distinction, we have moved from a situation where we follow natural law, practice through things like the principle of double effect, to where we have basically just adopted a form of utilitarianism. That there have to be certain lines where we cannot do something regardless of the consequences because of the nature of the act, right? And in the modern world, one of the lines along that that line of reasoning that really stands out to us is this line of stopping somebody who's actively harming others and using force on someone who has information we want but who is not actively promoting the harm of other people. It is a fine line, but it is an important one if we're going to be followers of natural law versus followers of utilitarianism. Now, obviously there's a lot more we could say about this issue of torture and terror suspects, but I think that gives you kind of a general introduction into how I would understand it, and also I think the way that the bishops would respond to it. But I will also ask you to look at the bishop's response to this issue of torture. And then I'm also going to give you a link to an article by a fairly noted political commentator who argues for, in fact, the approval of the use of torture in these sort of extreme situations, right? And you can read for yourself. I mean, the argument is essentially that if we're honest with ourselves, we're going to use torture in these sort of extreme situations. So let's come up with some rules for how we ought to do it. And again, a line of reasoning you hear a lot today, but I think one that is going to be problematic from the perspective of Catholic ethics. And just to finish up this conversation honest, I think in terms of Catholic social teaching in particular, we need to think about that argument, right? Because I will imagine that for some of you, that article is going to be fairly persuasive. But I think what Catholic social teaching asks us to do is to look not just at individual acts or individual people, but to think about social systems, right? Is our economic system as a whole set up justly? Is our political system set up justly? And in this case, to think about what are the implications of setting up a systematic approval and structure for the use of torture, right? And what would be the consequences of that, right? So that even if we were to be convinced of the moral legitimacy of the use of torture in these extreme situations, which I'm not, but let's assume that we are, what would we think about the implications of setting up a legal political system for the administration of torture, right? And what are going to be the ramifications of doing that? Because even beyond the effects on the individual detainee and their torturer, we would have to think about what are the implications for our society of setting up this as an official part of our political and governmental system. And I think there are real issues to consider there. But again, we can discuss that some more on Blackboard. And so at this point, I think, given all the things I want to discuss on Blackboard, we should probably wrap this up. And so I will give you, as I said, some of these readings, Weigel's article, and also the document from the bishops on the use of torture, the article advocating the use of torture, and then also Hauerwas's reflection on pacifism in the post 9/11 world. And I'll ask you to look at those and then to share your thoughts on this, right? Because there's a lot of big, complicated issues we've talked about here. And so I do want to take some time to discuss them with you. So I look forward to hearing your thoughts on all of that. And of course, if you have any questions, feel free to let me know, and we can continue this conversation online.